go for refuge until I'm enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. So we've been, returning kind of to the text of the stages of the path, right? Lama Tsongkhapa's middle length text on Lamrim, or the stages of the path to enlightenment. So we recently began this section on the great scope, right? The scope of the bodhisattvas, or those who strive for full enlightenment of Buddhahood. And let's pick up right so at the beginning of near the beginning of that chapter, he's talking about why we need to generate bodhicitta and what bodhicitta is and so on. And he starts with this point about praising compassion. And he makes this point. He said, this is where we left off. He says, compassion, for spiritual practice, and particularly for Mahayana, Mahayana, great vehicle, spiritual practice, or the spiritual practice of the bodhisattva, and for somebody who's trying to become enlightened, fully enlightened, then he says, compassion is important in the beginning, compassion is important in the middle, and compassion is important in the end. And so what he's getting at there is compassion. Swami Dalai Lama sometimes says, what's the main topic, of Buddhist, of Tibetan Buddhist, or Indo-Tibetan Buddhist training? He says compassion. The Dalai Lama often says what? He says, that's it, what's his religion? Kindness. So he's saying the essence of Buddhist practice is compassion. Lama Tsongkhapa is making kind of the same point. And so what he's saying is that, he says in the beginning, right, I'll just review the first two parts because we left off in the middle of this. So he says in the beginning, a bodhisattva, right, so somebody who's striving for full enlightenment, they wouldn't begin if it weren't for compassion. In other words, that the spiritual, that kind of spiritual practice begins when one generates great compassion. If you remember, in the middle scope, right, we frame that kind of as compassion for oneself. Here it's a greater compassion. It's a compassion that's not just for oneself. Right? It's a compassion that cherishes. Cherish means like loves, right? Loves all beings. It has compassion for all beings. And so the bodhisattva path begins, right, with great compassion. Then he says in the middle, right? He says in the middle, if you don't have great compassion, he points out, he says like, the practice of compassion will sometimes be challenging because not everybody's pleasant. We're not always pleasant. And so he points out, in the middle, if you don't have great compassion, you'll give up. Right? You'll just sort of blow off your spiritual practice and fall back to not practicing. And then we're up those we talked about last time, so I just was reviewing. And then he says, and compassion is also important in the end. And so he makes this point. He says, in a way, the whole point of the practice, right, is to achieve Buddhahood. And Buddhas work for the welfare of others out of compassion. Right? In other words, in a sense, a Buddha is somebody who has fully developed compassion. Right? And compassion itself, and also the means to put it into practice by helping others. That's what a Buddha is, right? And so he says, I'll just read what he says here. He says, the fact that even when the Buddhas have achieved the result, they do not dwell in their own individual peace, he's saying. But bring about the welfare of others, as vast as the vastness of space, is due to the power of their compassion. And so this idea is that, the Buddhist view, especially Mahayana Buddhist view, is that Buddhas manifest in kind of infinite different ways to help others, to educate others, to teach others the path. And why do they do so? Because of compassion for others. Who are those others? Us, right? We're included in that. So it's saying, even in the end, compassion is important, or is the essential thing. And then Lama Tsongkhapa quotes Chandrakirti, he quotes actually the text that Ken Rinpoche is going to be teaching at the center in July. And it's interesting, Chandrakirti in his main text on emptiness, which is a philosophical text, he begins right towards the beginning by praising compassion. And he says, and sometimes they say, why does he start by praising compassion rather than wisdom? And he points out the same thing Lama Tsongkhapa is saying. It's compassion that gives rise to all the trainings, all of spiritual practice. Right? Everything comes from compassion. So Chandrakirti says, for a harvest, what is important in the beginning is the seed, in the middle it's water, and at the end the maturation. Likewise, for the harvest of Buddhahood, what is important in the beginning, the end, and the middle is compassion. So the same point is made. Right? And so it's interesting, I just make that point, that Chandrakirti was famed as like, probably one of the greatest Buddhist philosophers of ancient India, from the Lama monastery, monastic university, who wrote many profound texts, or numerous profound texts. But Chandrakirti is making the same point that the Dalai Lama makes, that Lama Tsongkhapa makes. So it's like part of Lama Tsongkhapa's approach here is to say, he's pointing out, I didn't just make this up. Right? Chandrakirti made the same point. In other quotes you can see, Nagarjuna makes the same point, the Buddha makes the same point. What he's saying is, this has always been the essence of Mahayana Buddhist practice, is the practice of compassion. And then he says, then there's another paragraph here where he says, he quotes this certain Tibetan named Zang Nachung Tompa, which means something like funny nose or something like that, the guy's name is. And the guy was complaining, right? So he went to Dromdompa, who was this great master, and who was a student of Atisha. And he said to Dromdompa, I asked the elder Atisha for instructions, and nothing came of it other than Atisha saying to me, abandon worldly thoughts and cultivate bodhicitta. So the guy was like complaining, right? He was like disappointed. He said, I went for some profound instructions, and all he said was that, right? All he said was abandon worldly thoughts and cultivate compassion, cultivate bodhicitta. And then Lama Dromdompa, right, the great master, said, you got the central point of his instructions, the elder's instructions. He knew the key points of the teachings, the Dharma, right? So like, actually we're like that sometimes. I think Lama Tsongkhapa includes this because sometimes we're like this guy with the funny nose. Right, it's like he was looking for something that sounded very mystical, right? Or sounded very profound. He wanted something with like a fancy name. And the teacher said, basically right, like, he said, stop focusing on egoistic everyday stuff and focus on compassion. Focus on bodhicitta. So Lama Dromdompa is saying that's the essence of all the Dharma. He gave you the most profound instruction. Obviously the guy didn't think that at first, right? He was saying, I wanted something like Mahamudra or Dzogchen or Tantric something or other, I don't know, some kind of higher sounding thing, I suppose. And so Lama Tsongkhapa is making a point there. He's saying, why does he include that? He's not including it to make fun of this guy, right? He's saying, he's including it to point out for us, right? Like as the reader, to say, don't make the mistake of thinking there's something else, right? Chandrakirti said, in the beginning, in the middle, and the end, it's compassion. Atisha said the same thing, right? And so he's saying, if you think, there's some other thing that's more profound than compassion, then you have misunderstood the essence of the Buddhist teachings. The essence of the Buddhist teachings is compassion. Does that make sense? So it's actually quite a profound thing. And then he says something else interesting, right? Because sometimes we could say, well, compassion seems simple, right? It's like emptiness or some other topics seem difficult. And then he says, it's difficult to gain certainty about this. So you must accumulate merits and purify your negativities again and again, study scriptures such as the Array of Stock Sutra as well as their commentaries, and seek firm certainty. And then he quotes Ashwagosha saying, who said in a verse of poetry says it's of the Buddha, your mind, heroic one, is precious, the seed of complete enlightenment. Only you know it as the essence. Other beings do not guess that. So what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here is like, I think it's an important point, actually. Like, I think what he's getting at is, if you think, compassion, that's simple. Like, I get that. But he's saying that you've missed it. If you don't understand how profound the practice of compassion is, and if you just sort of think, it's some simple thing, then you don't understand what he's saying. You don't understand the teaching. that make sense? Because he's saying, right, just to understand this point about the profundity of compassion, you have to like study and purify and accumulate merit. Right? And so I guess what I'm getting at is I want to pause there and say, you know, so I think for us, we have to pause and go, okay, so what's he getting at? Right? What kind of compassion is he talking? You know, because I mean, like, you know, I know compassion, like in the sense of if my friend falls down and hurts their knee and I feel bad for them and I give them a Band-Aid, like I know all about that. That's not profound. I know that. That's familiar. So he's saying there's something more to understand here, right? And we have to really contemplate. And he's going to go on to explain it. And you'll see how profound, or I don't know how to say it right. It's like the kind of compassion he's going to start addressing here is a kind of compassion that we. What's this say right? Sometimes they say this in Buddhism. They say. Like the compassion that a bodhisattva has for others is something that you've not even dreamt of on your own behalf yet. It's that deep a compassion. It's that profound a compassion. So we're going to have to explore, like, what's he saying? Does that make sense? He's kind of warning you, though. Don't assume that you already know the answer about what compassion really is, because it's a very deep, profound topic. So then he starts to explain a little bit more about compassion here. And, oh, go ahead.
Question. I may have missed it, I wasn't here last time. I just read through the beginning, middle, end. Is it symbolism that there's a beginning and there's an end to this process? Or I don't really see the distinction as to why it's important in the beginning, why it's important in the middle. It's kind of a stream to me.
Oh, no, like, so what he's getting at the beginning would be like, so if an ordinary person, right, like who's not yet a bodhisattva, right, and then they generate compassion by doing the profound methods he's about to teach, right, and they eventually give rise to bodhicitta itself, right, that's the beginning, right. Then as they're training, so that's the beginning of their bodhisattva career, you could say. And then he makes a point, he says, then as they're training in that, they practice the 6 perfections, giving, ethics, patience, giving, ethics, patience, joyful effort, concentration and wisdom. And so what he's saying is, as they're practicing those, they'll sometimes meet with difficulties. For example, like they're trying to help somebody and be patient with them, and then the person is even more and more belligerent, and so on. Or they try to give something to somebody, and the person attacks them, and so on. And there will come the temptation to give up compassion, right, to abandon the bodhisattva career. And he's saying in that middle phase, one has to strengthen one's compassion and become a kind of brave, a kind of bold or courageous compassion that overcomes the obstacles of the path. And then he says at the very end of the path, because there is an end, which is Buddhahood, right? In other words, that's the end of that path of the bodhisattvas. That end is not an absolute end, though, right? It's an end that leads to a kind of, it's the end of the path itself, because it reaches the point of the completion of the path. But they continue to manifest limitlessly. And he says, so at the end, why is compassion important? That's the motivation behind that manifestation that Buddhists give. So he's saying there are kind of a distinction.
Right. Finding it, kind of working on perfection of it, and then getting ready to the next stage almost.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So next, Lama Tsongkhapa makes some kind of, I would almost call them like psychological points about compassion. He's trying to clarify some points. And so one point he makes here is he makes this point, I'll actually read this line. He says, if you think again and again about the suffering of a sentient being, this will generally give rise to a mere wish that they be free from that suffering. Okay? So what he's getting at there, right, is like he's starting to get into the profundity of compassion. Right? So he's saying, this is not for somebody else, for us, right? He's saying if you sit down and think about, like somebody who's going, like, there are countless examples, right? If you don't think about them, you won't generate any compassion, right? But if you start like thinking in detail about, whether it's your friend who has a headache, or whether it's somebody like a refugee in Syria, or whether it's a person in the hospital, or whether it's whoever it is, right? If you start to think in detail about their suffering, you'll develop some feeling of, wishing they were free from that suffering. Right? And he says the mere wish. Right? So it's a kind of passive mere, or almost like a passive wish. You know what I mean? Like if you said, oh, so-and-so's having if somebody came to you and said, oh, my friend has cancer and they're going through a hard time, you would say, oh, that's too bad, I hope they get better, right? It's a mere wish. It's like kind of not very, deep at that point. Then he says, however, for this mind to arise easily, and for it to arise in a very strong and stable way, to start with, it must be a sentient being who has the aspect of being attractive and valuable. For when someone close to us meets with suffering, we cannot bear it. Now he's making a point, right? So he's going to go into detail here. He's going to say, just thinking about the suffering of others actually is not enough. Right? And what he gets at is he says, actually, for your enemies, when you hear their suffering, you're happy. It's the opposite of compassion. And sometimes if you really hate somebody and you hear they're going through a hard time, you say, oh, good, I hope it continues and gets worse. So he says, so just thinking, he's making a point here, right? Psychologically, he's saying, check your own mind, right? And then he says also, if you really don't care about somebody, just like, and you may, if you're polite, you might say, oh, I hope they're better, right? But actually, you don't really care, right? And so what he's getting at here is he's saying, actually, it's how much you feel close to the person, and how much you sort of treasure them, or value them, or think they're important to you, right? That correlates to how much compassion you'll feel. And so this point, I just want to pause and say, so think about that in terms of your own experience, right? Like, because, right, it's like, you can see that, can't you? Right? Like, in other words, you can hear about horrible suffering from somebody if you don't really know who they are, or if you kind of think they're part of a group that you would label your enemy. You might say, I don't know, it depends how polite you are, but whatever you would say, there's not a strong feeling of compassion there. But then if it's your own, right, the person closest to you, right, as he says, then it's totally unbearable. Right? And so he's getting at a point here, right, almost like if you were to think of it spatially, right, the further away the person is from you and your emotions, the less you have compassion, and the closer they are to you, the more you have compassion. And he differentiates 3 different groups. And this is going to become important later, so I just want to make this point. So he particularly differentiates 3 different groups. He says close ones or friends, right? For them, you feel a kind of unbearable feeling. Close, especially if they're very close to you, right? Your own child, or your own parent, or your own sibling, or spouse, or something, right? If you get along well with them, right? Then you'll feel some kind of unbearable feeling. Then strangers, when you hear their suffering, oftentimes you don't really care too much. Right? You kind of don't have much feeling. And enemies, you may actually be pleased they're suffering. And then he makes a point. He says, this is because the friends are attractive to us. Right? And he makes this point then. He says, also, how much we cherish that person, right? How much we value them will correlate to how much we feel compassion for them. And they often use the, sometimes, I think here he uses it, so sometimes they use the example in the next paragraph, of a mother for their child, right? Like, oftentimes this is true, not always, of course, but oftentimes it's true, right? Mothers, like, can't sleep at night if their child is sick, if their child is going through some difficulty, right? Whereas, like, the next door neighbor might sleep fine, right? Doesn't care that much. Oh, that's too bad, right? So it's a matter of how you get this idea. It's really getting at an emotional truth, right? How close we feel, or how committed we feel, or how much we cherish the person. That's going to correlate to how much compassion we feel for their suffering. And he makes this point. He says, and there's a point here that he makes. I just want to explain. He uses the word attractive. He says, like, somebody who's attractive, we feel a lot of compassion. He doesn't mean attractive in terms of appearance, right? Like that they're pretty or handsome or something. What he's getting at is this feeling in ourselves of, like, attachment, actually, right? How attached we are, how much we sort of feel almost like identified with them. So if I say, like, and actually you know that, right? If somebody says, oh, I read a story about somebody who was going through a terrible suffering, you kind of go, oh, what did the story say, right? Whereas if they say, if somebody says, like, oh, my parent is going through that, right? Then immediately you have some sympathy, like, oh, wow, that must be hard for you. We know that, right? I mean, he's not saying something that isn't relatable in experience. And so again, he's differentiating these three groups: friends, enemies, and strangers, and how we. But then he's saying even within those there are gradations. Does that make sense? Like so, even within our friends, we have more feeling of cherishing them or something, the closest ones, and then the compassion will be stronger. And then friends who are more distant, it's less, and so on. So then he makes a point here, which is he says, we're going to go through two different methods of giving rise to bodhicitta. And he's making a point, he's saying, these methods then, therefore, because of this psychological truth, these methods have to help us to feel close to and loving towards and affectionate towards and sort of a sense of cherishing for all beings, or else they're not going to be effective in giving rise to profound compassion. So do you see why he was making this psychological point now? He's sort of saying this point of, you won't give rise to great compassion unless you feel close to and a sense of kinship or warmth or attachment or all just, synonyms for this idea that if you don't feel that for beings, then your compassion will be kind of weak, right, or flimsy or not very profound. And so he's making this point then, he's saying, so we have to develop this kind of feeling of closeness. And then he's obviously implying, and we don't have that yet, right? And right now we have people who we think are enemies who we feel distant from and hope they'll suffer or fail, right? We have most people to us are strangers where we don't really care what happens to them. And so he's recognizing that, and he's saying, if you can't change that, then just making some prayer, oh, may everyone be free from suffering, may everybody, be okay, may everybody be well, is just words, right? We have to actually develop a feeling in ourselves of closeness, and then the compassion will become more powerful. So then he makes a point here, because he's entering into the first method, the first of the two methods for generating bodhicitta, which is the method of the sevenfold cause and effect method. And so he makes this point, he says, with this method, the first 3 points are meditating on all beings as one's mother, remembering their kindness and generating the wish to repay their kindness. And he says, if you succeed in those 3 steps, it establishes for you, experientially, everyone as dear and as attractive, or as an object of affection. And he says, the love, I'll read the sentence, this is an important point. The love that holds sentient beings to be delightful as one's only child is the effect of these 3. It produces compassion. So he's making a point, right? He's saying, if you do those 3 points, then you'll give rise to a kind of love for everybody. Like a parent has for their only child, as a mother for their only child, for a parent. The love that holds sentient beings as delightful as one's only child, so that's the father or the mother there. He says, then that will give rise to an extreme form of love for everyone, which will give rise to an extreme form of compassion. Now I want to pause. Can you start to see now why he said, this is not a simple topic? This is quite profound. Because can you imagine that? Like, can you imagine if you were going on the metro, and your feeling was, right, this is what he's getting at here, that the feeling a bodhisattva has when they look at anyone on the subway or on whatever, is as deep and as affectionate and as loving as a parent for their only child. Especially especially when you see a parent with their baby, or with a very young child, that's the emotional experience of the bodhisattva. And it's for everyone equally, is the implication, right? Can you even imagine that kind of mind? And he's saying that's the mind of a bodhisattva. Right? So you see the psychological point. We have to first develop a feeling of closeness, and then he's saying, in this method, how do we do that? By meditating on beings as one's mother, by remembering their kindness, and by wishing to repay their kindness. And then he makes another point, again, it's just a psychological point, really, or a practical point for meditation, is he says, in this method, love comes first and then compassion. And then he says, but actually, experientially, there's no definite order. Sometimes compassion will come first, giving rise to love, and sometimes love will come first, giving rise to compassion. So he says, we're going to see in the method they're in a certain order, but he makes a point that those 2 inner states can sometimes arise in either order. And that really means this, is like, if you're developing a feeling of deep closeness to someone, right? This feeling of closeness to them, if you then specifically see them suffering, compassion will arise. Or if you just think of them in some general way, a feeling of warmth and love and kindness will arise. So he's saying partly it depends on the situation. If they're suffering terribly, then compassion may come first. But that those two minds, love and compassion, have to both be present in this teaching. And then he makes a point, so now he's going to teach this method, the 7-point cause and effect method. And he makes a point just that this method comes from a lineage, an ancient Buddhist lineage. It came down through Chandrakirti, Acharya Chandrakirti, who we just mentioned, Kamala Shila, Venerable Chandra, and so on. So there are many teachers in this lineage of the 7-point cause and effect. And then he raises another point here. So in the 7-point cause and effect method, it's first there's a preliminary point, which we're going to get into in a minute, which is equanimity. And then the method itself is what he just said, right? Meditating on beings as one's mother, recollecting the kindness, and generating the wish to repay the kindness. And then there's love and compassion. And then there's what they call the unusual attitude of universal responsibility. In Tibetan, laksam, which means just like special or unusual attitude, which is this attitude of altruism or universal, sometimes the Dalai Lama calls it the unusual attitude of altruistic universal responsibility, a feeling of being responsible for the welfare of others. And so he raises a doubt. He says, if compassion is enough, if compassion is so important, right, then why do they add in this point about the unusual attitude of universal responsibility? He's raising like a doubt. Why would somebody, you might say, well, why is that point there? And then he answers it. And he makes a point here, just this is more for those who are, who are familiar with Buddhist training or something. But he makes this point, he says, those who are practicing the lesser vehicle, actually, right? So somebody who's trying to just achieve their own individual liberation from samsara. Sometimes they call them Shravakas, right? Hearers, or Pratyeka Buddhas, solitary realizers, and so on. So he's saying people who are not bodhisattvas, right, who are just trying to achieve their own individual freedom from samsara, he says they also give rise to immeasurable compassion and love that thinks if only sentient beings were to meet with happiness, if only they were free from suffering. So he's saying even spiritual practitioners who are not Mahayana have that kind of love and compassion. And then he makes a point, he says, so the unique point that differentiates the Mahayana practitioner at an inner level from somebody who's not Mahayana, right, who's not practicing the great vehicle, is this attitude of universal responsibility, or the unusual attitude. And then he says something I just want to read because I think it's important or beautiful. He says, therefore, it is necessary to generate the extraordinary attitude, that's the way they're translating the term here, this special attitude of those with brave hearts. And so he's getting a point here that there's a bravery that differentiates mere compassion, right? The mere wish that others be happy, and mere love, from the courageous or brave heart that takes on responsibility for the welfare of others. Does that make sense? Get the idea there? And so he's saying that's an important, he's raising, before he gets into the actual training, he's raising some important points for us to consider so we understand what we're doing. Does that make sense? And so he's saying the goal is to give rise to this brave, courageous heart that takes the responsibility for the welfare of others. And he says that's the unusual attitude, or this extraordinary attitude, and only only Mahayana practitioners give rise to that kind of brave, courageous inner state. And then he says, once you've given rise to that brave, courageous version of compassion, or form of compassion, then bodhicitta will come naturally. It's a result. Does that make sense? It's the natural result of those. And he says, why so? He says, because once you've given rise to the kind of unbearable compassion that takes responsibility for the welfare of others, he says, then you'll look at yourself and you'll look and say, he makes a funny point here, he says, I have this wish to free all sentient beings from suffering, but I can't even free one sentient being from suffering. I can't even free myself from suffering, right? And so although I have the wish, I'm powerless to actually achieve that wish, right? Especially to lead others to enlightenment. I mean, we can help somebody in a very short-term, small way, but until sometimes I say, you can't give somebody what you don't have. So there is, if you have a headache and I happen to have some Advil, I can say, hey, you want an Advil? If I don't have any Advil, I can't give it to you, right? You can only give somebody what you have access to. Right? And so what he's saying here is, if you haven't yourself achieved enlightenment, you can't lead somebody else to enlightenment. Right? And so if your wish is to free all others from all their suffering, once you've given rise to that unusual attitude, you look around and you say, well, how am I going to possibly affect the welfare of others? And he says, so at that point, you'll look and you'll say, I can't even free myself from suffering. I'm still subject to anger and impatience and jealousy and pride and all that. And then you'll recognize, I have to achieve Buddhahood, and then I can be most effective in helping others, because that's what a Buddha is somebody who's most effective at helping others to become enlightened. And so then, naturally, this unusual attitude of altruism, or extraordinary attitude of altruism, the brave heart of like that, naturally leads a person to generate bodhicitta. Does that make sense? So he's describing how it's like a sequence of inner, and you get the idea, this is not some sequence that's some like intellectual thing, right? It's an experience that the person who's training to become a bodhisattva goes through. And until somebody's gone through all these steps, they're not a bodhisattva. Once somebody has gone through those steps, they are a bodhisattva. That's the difference. Does that make sense? So you haven't yet begun the Mahayana. They sometimes say you can be a Mahayana Buddhist but not be practicing, you're not on the path of the Mahayana, right? When you've entered the path of the Mahayana is when you've given rise to bodhicitta. Up until then, you're like, you can aspire, or you can admire that, or you can wish to become that, right? Or sort of, you can do a facsimile of bodhisattva training. But once you've given rise to bodhicitta through this sequence, then you're an actual bodhisattva who's entered the 5 paths to enlightenment. So I'll pause there, because then he enters another section on equanimity. Any questions about that up to there? So he was just making various points about compassion and bodhicitta. Any questions, or should I go on to the equanimity? Straightforward. I hope you're not going, oh, it's just simple. Because he warned, if you think that, then you've gotten off track. Yeah.
It sounds hard.
So now he gets into an interesting point. He says, first he says, okay, so if you're going to do the 7-point cause and effect method for generating bodhicitta, you start with a preliminary point of equanimity. And then he says, actually, before getting to equanimity, there are other preliminary practices to do. And then he says, but those are what we're taught in the beginning of, up to now in the text. So he's saying, so I'm not going to go over those all again because I just taught them. And he says, so do those, right? And then he says, having done those, right? So meditated on the importance of the spiritual teacher, precious human rebirth, impermanence in death, karma, refuge, the middle scope, the sufferings of samsara, and generating the wish to become liberated from samsara. He says those are all preliminary points to generating, to doing this method of bodhicitta. So he says, you should adopt those and sustain them here. Right? This should be done in the context of those earlier trainings. That's an important point. So you can't, he's making this point that he made at the beginning of the whole Lam Rim, which is you can't, it's stages of the path to enlightenment, right? And he's saying, so you can't skip. You can't skip over like they call them the practices in common with the low scope and the practices in common with the middle scope. And he's saying if you try to skip those, nothing will really happen. Your practice won't bear fruit. So he says that's the foundation, so you should do those. He even calls it that, laying the foundation. Having done those, you then meditate on equanimity. And what he says here is you want to develop an equanimous mind, having stopped the bias of attachment to some, hatred to others. Because if you don't, then any love and compassion that arise will arise with partiality. And a bodhisattva needs to overcome such partiality. So I want to make a point there. This is actually an important point too, right? Because if, again, he's differentiating here mere love or mere compassion, right? Point is, some of these things gangsters, right, have a lot of, what's the word? loving affection, like for their family members and cohorts, right? And they kill other people sometimes to protect them, right? Same goes for like dictators. So like, there's just to say, oh, I have some love and compassion for somebody is not enough, right? And we're just like seeing an article recently about like the few people who Hitler loved or something. You know, it's like, okay, everybody has somebody they love. That's not sufficient for a spiritual practice. Does that make sense? You know, because and he's making a point here. He's saying because that kind of love is what's the word? It's thoroughly mixed with attachment and partiality, right? And it actually gives rise to then hatred for others, right? Whereas if you have that kind of love where you feel, well, you know, it's like this feeling, right? Like, well, it's like that, right? Like, so if it's like I love my, right? It's actually ego-centered, right? I love my family. Right? So therefore, if somebody harms my family, I want to actually harm them. Or I love my country, then I want to kill people from some other country who aren't friends of my country, and so on. So that kind of, that love with partiality, and actually then eventually, of course, what happens? Even the people you include in your love, well, if they don't do what you want, then you exclude them, right? You take somebody else, right? That's like, when it's love with partiality, right? Then like, so for example, like the person says, oh, I love my partner, right? Then when the partner does something they don't like, then they say, well, now I love this partner, right? So it's like a unsteady, does that make sense? Mind that actually increases eventually, that kind of attachment or bias or something like that, actually, of course, increases our afflictive emotions, right? You know, so we feel like, oh, my group is better than theirs, right? That's pride, right? Then we feel, well, my group should have more, why do they have more, right? Then that's like jealousy. Right? Then somebody harms my group, right? Then I want to kill them, so harm them. So he says that kind of love and compassion, if that's all you generate, that's not the basis for any kind of spiritual practice. And then he makes another point. He says, this is for, again, for people who are familiar with Buddhist training. He makes a few points here. One is he says, there's like, and sometimes you'll see, actually in the prayer books, for example, there's a prayer that says things like, may all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free of hatred and attachment. And that's a genuine kind of, what's the word, meditation in Buddhism. He's saying, but that's not what we're doing here. He's actually differentiating. He's saying, that's a valid form of spiritual practice, but that's not what we're doing here. We're not wishing that others have equanimity. Here, you're trying to make your own mind have equanimity. Does that make sense? And he says, so you're trying to eliminate the hatred and attachment from yourself in your own heart. And he's saying, so that's the training next. That's the training. He's like, Lama Tsongkhapa is kind of saying, that's the training I'm talking about here. And so there are various ways to do this practice, but in this context, what you do is, usually I'll describe the actual meditation now. So you actually, this is a formal meditation, right? So you would sit down to meditate or whatever, and you would, you choose a specific person for each category to start with. Right? So you start with, you imagine them in front of you, like a stranger, a friend, and an enemy. Friend can include like family member, loved one, somebody you're close to. And the enemy, it can, and also, and the enemy can be a person you know, or just somebody you feel aversion to, or hatred for, or anger towards, who's in, like, what's the word? Who you've only seen in, like, newspapers or TV, whatever. It can either be, each of these can be, like in a stranger also, it can be somebody you passed by on the street, or it can be somebody you saw, like, on a newscast or something like that. And so you visualize all three of them in front of you. And he says, he advises, and again, he's being, this is not a philosophical point, it's a practical point, is he says, now when you're going to start meditating, he says, start with the stranger. He says, contemplate them first, because it'll be easier. Then go on to I'm going to call it friend, like loved one, or whatever you want to say. Then move on to the friend, and then go to the enemy. He says, and after that, you can focus on all beings. But he makes a point here, he says, but don't start with all beings. He says, start with the people who you actually feel some, does that make sense? Because you're trying, there's this point, if you just said, like if you were just to sort of space out, like, you know, being like, what's this thing, it's like pseudo-Buddhist thing, ego trip or something, like, you know, everybody's equal, it's all fine, I'm cool with everybody, everybody's great, you know, that's not what he's talking about. What he's saying is, no, like, think of the person where when you see them, you think, oh, like that, you have some feel, he says, put them right there. Does that make sense? The stranger, be honest with yourself, like, pick somebody where you think, you know, I passed by them and I didn't even, like, if they had dropped dead, I wouldn't have really thought much. You have to be honest with you. Does that make sense? He's getting, you have to be honest with yourself here. Does that make sense? And the person you have attachment to, it's somebody where you really feel that feeling of like, you know, no, if somebody were hurting them, I'd want to kill the person. I'd want them like attacked. Yeah.
Now, I guess my translation is very focused meditation on three individuals. But are you focusing on them from a physical standpoint, a existential standpoint? I mean, what's the...
Yeah, if you can visualize...
you really focus your mind?
Yeah, if you can visualize, actually visualize their face there, or their body there, because the reason being, it gives rise to a visceral feeling, and that's what we're trying to work through. Does that make sense? So, like, you want it, like, that's what I'm getting at. It should be actually, like, what's your say, right? You know, like, where, like, when you look at the stranger, like, if you're actually, you imagine them there, if you can visualize them. If you can even take a photo and, you know, put it there, whatever. Usually Buddhists, of course, traditionally they would visualize them. But you think of them and you actually get the feel, you try to actually start off by actually generating the feeling of, oh yeah, I walked by them, didn't even notice they existed hardly. Like, almost like they were, you know, like I passed by a tree, I passed by a bench, and I passed by them and I hardly noticed the difference.
They're like a tree.
Yeah, they had all the reality of a tree to me, honestly, if I'm honest in that moment. You think back to a moment where you're walking somewhere and you think, oh, I didn't really notice their humanity. I just passed by them as if they were the same as the bench that they were sitting on. I didn't notice them any more than I noticed the bench. Right? Then the friend, you want to like actually see them and really feel like, you know, a friend or loved one or spouse or child or whatever, you know, whatever that would be. But this feeling of like, wow, this person's special. Like, I want to be near them. I want them in my life. If they left, everything would be terrible. If somebody hurt them, I'd want to get rid of that person. Like, I just want to be close to this person. You know, like you get that feeling. And then the enemy, it should be somebody where you really feel some sense of like disgust or aversion or hatred or anger, whatever the feeling is that, you know, for that person. And because the idea is that's what we're trying to work through. You know, and if you can't, if you pick somebody who's too generic, then you're not actually working through anything. You're just sort of like, you're not really working with your own mind, right?
When you say, when you're working through it, let's pick a person that most people think was a bad person, Hitler. Yeah. If you're visualizing Hitler, is it simply to meditate on all of his badness?
No, I mean, then we're going to get to what you actually do, but we're starting with the person who generates that feeling naturally, like you're not yet meditating. Whereas we're starting just by who is it, like who for you generates that feeling in a spontaneous, like when you think of their face, you immediately think, oh, like so if that's Hitler for you, put him as the enemy, for example. Right, like that's not yet the meditation, that's just our natural, like our, what's the word, ingrained habit. And so everybody has somebody, you know what I mean?
Immediate cause and effect, you see the picture, you feel something.
Yeah, exactly. As soon as you would think of that person or hear their name or like you immediately feel some feeling of, in that case it would be anger, you know, something, or hatred or disgust or aversion or something like that. Right? You know, and the same thing, like, whereas, yeah, so we're not yet meditating, we're just sort of identifying that we have to choose somebody. I guess my point is, before we begin, the very first thing is you have to think of wwho you're going to use for this. And each time you do it, you can use different people. Also, you know, for one session, stick with the same, you know, the same three people.
Right.
But then, you know, like, actually you'll see one of the things if you do this meditation regularly, one thing you'll see is like, sometimes the person, you know, we'll get to this in a minute, but the categories change, of course, they're not permanent. But so it's like you have to say, who right this moment? Because actually, I'll give an example, like, the person who was your friend, who you felt, I can't bear to be separate from them, I adore them, you know, tomorrow they might be the enemy, right? Because they said something that got on your nerves and you're really angry at them. You know, so then like, you know, you say, well, yesterday they were in the friend category. Today they're definitely in the enemy category because they told me this, you know, they frowned at me and said that. And today I feel really averse to them, so I'm going to put them there. So it'll change over time. And the person you thought was an enemy, of course, there may come a day where you say, oh, they're my closest, I adore them, so I'm going to put them in the friend category. So that'll change, but for that moment, it's the person you feel today. Does that make sense? Because, of course, these are not permanent categories, which is part of what we're about to get to, but they feel permanent. when you're feeling it. Does that make sense also? If they didn't, you wouldn't want to, right? Like they wouldn't be so visceral and almost like these feelings. I mean, often those feelings are almost violent in a way. So anyway, that's so you get the idea though. So you start with 3 people. That's it. And he says do it in that order from a practical point of view. Stranger, in the meditation itself, go stranger, friend, enemy. And here in this text, Lama Tsongkhapa mainly covers this through 2 points. Actually, in the easy path, Khen's Rinpoche gives additional points, a longer list of meditation topics for this. But Lama Tsongkhapa here gives 2. And he says they come from Kamala Shila, the famous Buddhist monastic. So the first point is, now comes the actual meditation. So you start with the stranger, right? If you're doing the practice, right? You're visualizing the stranger there. And the first thing you meditate on is, okay, this person who I felt so indifferent towards, barely noticed they existed, internally wants to be happy just as much, and to not suffer just as much as I do, and just as much as anybody else does. They have a subjective, right? So you're putting yourself in their shoes for a moment. Does that make sense? You're empathizing with them. So you're contemplating, you're saying, wow, like, I barely noticed they existed, but the truth is, like, they have fear just like I have. They have hopes just like I have. They have connections to others just like I have. They are sometimes terrified of suffering. They desperately want to be happy. And so you look at them in your mind, right? You like sort of think of them, and you might even, again, whoever that person is, you might even contemplate, well, what might, I mean, you're thinking this in general because you know it's true, or actually it is true, right? Everybody's the same in this way. That's the basis of equanimity. We're all the same in wanting to be happy and not wanting to suffer, as this always Dalai Lama often points out. Here, as you're meditating on it, you would actually think of the person themselves, and you would say, wow, actually, like, okay, again, if you were actually doing the practice, you might pause and notice, oh, wow, now that I think about it, like, that person is kind of like this, and I think that this is I have the impression that maybe they go through that. Wow, I never thought about that. Does that make sense? You start empathizing with their inner experience and recognizing just as much as me and just as much as my friend, they want to be happy and don't want to suffer. So that's the first point. And that you would, it's not just an intellectual thing. Again, you sit with it and you try to feel it. You almost like put yourself in their position. Does that make sense? Imagine being them and feeling those feelings. Until you start to feel, wow, they really are. Like you start to identify almost with their experience. Does that make sense? Just as you usually identify with your own. And then the second point of the 2 that Lama Tsongkhapa gives to meditate on is, I'll call this one uncertainty. Right? The uncertainty of relationships. In other words, so like, right now that person's a stranger. But those categories, you start to meditate on how those categories that I sort of relate to the world through that seem permanent to me are not permanent. And so he makes there are various ways to contemplate this. Like, one is, he says here, over the past, one point he makes, there are various ways to contemplate this one. So one about uncertainty is over the course of lifetimes, right? Like this person has been my child, they've been my parent, they've been my enemy, they've been my friend, they've been my boss, they've been my subordinate, they've been my neighbor. And also even in this life, right? We know this is true, right? Like, can you think about that? Like how many times have you walked by somebody or driven by their home or something, and you didn't know who they were, you didn't care, like, and then later they became like your either most cherished friend or most hated enemy. And you start to realize, oh wow, like I'm sort of putting people in a category of indifferent, in this case, this person, right? Of not caring. And now I'm going to go into a little more detail on Lama Tsongkhapa's, because, and part of that is just like, because they haven't done anything for me lately, right? Like, whereas if that person just gave me a few nice things and smiled at me, or helped me when I fell down or lost something, suddenly I would like them. Right? Like, it's kind of childish, actually, right? And then if they frowned at me and said one mean comment or just drove rudely, I would think, oh, they're a terrible person, right? Like, and you start to recognize, and this is, I think, an important point. Like, we put people mentally or emotionally into these categories that have nothing to do with who the person is from their own side. It's a projection. Does that make sense? I'm projecting that onto them. Another way of doing this, again, Lama Tsongkhapa doesn't go into this here, is to think, like, how does their child look at them? How does their mother look at them? In other words, I'm looking at them from my egocentric perspective, and therefore I think they're irrelevant to me because they're not giving me much right now, right? Like, that's like a temporary and somewhat ignorant projection onto who they are. Doesn't correlate to anything about their essence. Right? It doesn't correlate to their inner experience of wanting to be happy and not wanting to suffer. And it's a temporary categorization. And so then you do the same thing, right, with the friend, right? Where you recognize, like, oh wow, people like, and actually it happens all the time, right? Like, and so I'm just going to pause here. Like, you would use various reasons. You know, I mean, he gives these examples, right? Everybody wants to be happy, not want to suffer, and these are temporary. But as you meditate on this, you would keep meditating. You know, you could use all different kinds of examples, right? Like, you know, even in the world, right? Like, it's actually like unbelievable if you actually contemplate this deeply, right? Because like, this kind of categorization gives rise to actually all the violence in the world really comes from this kind of categorization, doesn't it? Whereas sometimes it's sort of funny if you think about, or it's not really funny because it's terrible, but or it's horrifying. But have you ever just thought about like our label, like on a national level? I'm not saying uniquely to the United States. All countries are like this, I think, to some extent. Right, but like, you're constantly like if you think like the British were like the most hated enemies during the Revolutionary War, and the United States was very fond of numerous, you know, Taliban fighters when they were fighting against Russia. In the 80s. I mean, that's just obvious examples. There are hundreds and hundreds of examples like that, right? Like, where it's like, what's there to say? We literally will kill somebody, right, over this label, enemy. Right, like, or even the person on death row, right? Like you say, oh, they're a murderer, right? Like, I hope they get killed, right? And then sometimes, you know, like recently, like you see a story, DNA evidence proves they were innocent, and you say, oh no, like, I don't want them to be killed. Like, it's our labeling, right? I'm just going to this point, whatever the circumstance, right? And then, like, if you contemplate this one, right, sometimes you see, if you watch like a couple on, sometimes when I meditate on this, I think of like friends of mine who, when they were, if I was there on their wedding day, and then I was there at the worst day of their divorce, from the same person, and like thinking of their facial expression, you know, when, like, the facial expression of my friend on his wedding day when he was looking at her and said, oh wow, you know, and then like when I was talking to him when he was going through like the worst part of the divorce and they had lawyers, and then like looking at his facial expression, and it was the same person, of course, the same two people, right? Just a different label, right? She was the friend, then she moves to the category of enemy. And my point here is like, it should be that visceral. Does that make sense? Like, you really have to make this experiential, where you and it can't only be, oh, other people are like that. Right? The main point, as Lama Tsongkhapa said, is is like, I'm like that. Does that make sense? And you keep meditating on it until you come to a place where, as I say, where you feel a sense of, I'll read, what is ceased is the mind of bias due to attachment, hatred, by alleging someone to be a friend or an enemy, whereas the mind of the friend and enemy does not need to be there. So what he's saying here is you start to recognize, this is an important psychological point here, is what he's getting at. What he's getting at really is you start to recognize your projection as a projection. Does that make sense? It doesn't change anything about the other person. You're not like transforming them. You're recognizing, oh wow, I'm projecting these labels onto these people. And based on those labels, I'm totally prejudiced, right? I'm totally biased. And I give rise to all kinds of problems, actually, due to that. And it's not, like, and you recognize my projections aren't realistic. I want to make another point here. Like, it's easy to recognize that other people's projections are not realistic. Right? It's very hard to recognize one's own projections, right? You'll feel, if you do this meditation, there will come times where you feel, yeah, but they aren't. Like, with the enemy, you'll feel, well, it's true they want to be happy and don't want to suffer. It's true that these categories are temporary. It's true that other people see them differently, but still they're a terrible person, I hate them, right? And that means you have to keep meditating, right? You know, that means you're stuck, right? And the same thing with the friend, right? You'll feel, well, of course these things are impermanent, right? And of course it's just based on some temporary circumstances that I'm labeling this person beloved and so important, and the most important person to me, and this and that. But they are, you'll feel, right? There'll be some feeling. That's the projection. Does that make sense? And you're not recognizing it yet. You may know it intellectually, but experientially you're not really seeing it as a projection. And you're not done meditating then, right? The meditation is when you shift experientially, when you start to feel, oh my God, I've been insane. You know, like, I've been nuts, actually. Like, whereas believing my own, not nuts in the sense of like anything other than I really believe my own projections and act on them, like all the time. And to the extent that I do that, like I oppress myself and others. Does that make sense? Because this is the basis of oppression. Actually, even the attachment is the basis of oppression, right? Whereas if you're attached to somebody in this way, of course, you may think, oh, well, that's good. Actually, what he's getting at here is, no, that's not good. You're then like sort of saying, well, because you fit in my category, I cherish you, but you better not change and step out of my, what's the word? My rigid label, you know, or else I'm going to pressure you to get back in it, right? I'll force you to do what I, you know, because then otherwise I can't love you. So you have to be exactly who I'm saying you should be, right? It's actually oppressive, this state of mind.
So, success may be the wrong word. Success may be the wrong word, but you've been successful once you're able to get to a point where you realize His Holiness and Hitler are no different.
Yeah, and wanting to be happy and not wanting to suffer, they're the same. Exactly.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It may be heading in this direction, but there was the way it's phrased on page 137 uses the phrase equanimity that neglects. And it's like
137. Say again. Where is it?
it's the very top, I think.
Okay.
And it's in that phrase. It's like I guess it means like you're imagining like a stranger and you don't really care about him, so it uses that term of like an equanimity that neglects.
Right, and he's saying this is not that kind of equanimity. Obviously, we're not trying to give rise to that kind of equanimity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the wrong kind of equanimity. I mean, that's the equanimity where, like, you're saying, like I mean, he's differentiating, right? Because there's a version of equanimity that's not what we're trying to cultivate, which is somebody says, oh, somebody's suffering terribly, and you say, oh, okay. They're not my friends, so I don't really care. Like, that's not, he's saying, yeah, don't give rise to that kind of equanimity. That's not the goal here. The goal is actually to recognize I have that kind of, I would call that indifference, right? Isn't that what he said? Neglect, indifference. What he's getting at there is that indifference itself, that's the word I would use for that statement, is in and of itself a projection, right? Or is that you're not seeing the person accurately for who they are if you feel indifferent to them. And actually, this is an important point from a Buddhist perspective. I'll just add this point because I think it relates to what you're getting at, which is, according to Buddhist psychology, if you feel compassion for somebody, then your mind is realistic in relation to them. Whereas because you're seeing, or at least it may be, unless your compassion is confused, but there's a kind of reasonable compassion. In other words, that people want to be happy and don't want to suffer, and they're suffering. Right? That's accurate, actually. And when you see that accurately, then your mind gives rise to a kind of compassion. Whereas indifference actually is a projection, an egocentric projection, right? Like, in other words, how are they helping, it's like I'm only categorizing people according to how they're relating to me and how much they're helping my egocentric sense of myself. And so if they're not helping my sense of self, then they're irrelevant. That's my indifference. That's a projection based on egocentrism. So it's very different. Does that make sense? And so what we're trying to do is not become indifferent to all beings, obviously, what we're trying to do is cut through that egocentric indifference.
So I was wondering, because it's like that prayer, like uses the four essential nots, three examples, but it's like you pray for equanimity, and then you pray for the end of suffering, and happiness and liberation.
Oh yeah, yeah, the four immeasurable thoughts.
Oh yeah. So it's not like an equanimity that's like, it's that compassionate equanimity, not just like they're free from like obsession or aversion. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can see how like it's a subtle, right? I mean, it's actually a subtle distinction, right? Again, you have to get it in your own experience, right? That it's not, as you say, right? Yeah, I mean, exactly what, you know, like how does this equanimity feel, right? It's part of, I think, what we have to explore experientially, you know, and that. Actually, I'll say this too. I mean, this kind of equanimity really is a peaceful, realistic mind. In other words, our mind, when we're caught up in indifference, aversion, or hatred, or whatever, and attachment, grasping, is actually agitated, right? And is uptight, and is sort of stressed out, and is tense, or something like that. And part of equanimity, right, is where the mind, they sometimes use this metaphor of like an even field in which crops can grow. Or they sometimes use the metaphor of like, if you imagine like water that's been like sort of with huge waves or something like that. And then like, I was just the other day thinking of it, like have you ever been to like a mountain lake in the morning or something where it's just like, there's no wind and it's just like placid and reflecting the sky? I mean, that could be a metaphor for how the mind of equanimity feels. Does that make sense? There's a kind of peacefulness, and actually I'm using that metaphor because one is that mountain lake is, there's no waves, so it's peaceful. But also then it can accurately reflect, like if you look at it, you can see what's going on in the sky, right? You can see the cloud passing by in the mountain water. I'm using that as a metaphor for one here because it's realistic. Does that make sense? Like, or it can reflect things realistically. The mind of equanimity is like that. You see what I mean? Like, one is it's peaceful for yourself. It's no longer agitated. Right? It's no longer insecure. It's no longer feeling. It doesn't any longer have this projection, and then therefore the projection gives rise to a kind of an agenda, right? Like, and actually, I'll just make this point. Like, the lack of equanimity is totally exhausting, right? Like, because, whereas when you don't have equanimity, right? So there's these people who are enemies, first of all, right? And those people you want to eliminate from your life, right? And eliminate from the world. And you're never going to. Right? Like, it's impossible. Right? Shanti Deva makes this point. Like, he says it's like trying to cover the entire earth in leather, right? Instead of covering your own shoes in leather, right? Your own feet, you know, in shoes. He says, like, put on a pair of shoes. Don't try to cover, you know. Bob Thurn then pointed out modern Western culture is the first culture to ever sort of make an attempt to cover the entire earth. You know, where we've made an effort at it, but it doesn't work, right? Because the weeds come up and the trees grow up through it. So one point is, like, the mind that lacks equanimity wants to eliminate all your enemies. Like, you wish you could somehow, like, you know, if you're violent, then you want to kill them. If not, then you'd like to just banish them to another planet. Neither one's going to happen, right? Actually, if you try to kill them, you'll just get more enemies. So, well, that continues. Then, right, the mind of attachment, right? Like, so you want these people to, like, sort of stay how they are towards you and always do what you want, right? Which, of course, they won't. And so that's also exhausting. And then, like, this mind that's sort of indifferent to the vast majority of people, somewhere deep down, you know, of course, well, they're people too, right? And their interests, actually, we know that also, right? And their interests are also my interests, right? And if their interests aren't working, I'm going to be miserable eventually. Does that make sense? Like, if their economic interests, if their well-being, if their health, like, you know, in other words, our bodies are such that if somebody gets a disease that's communicable, you know, we get a disease that's communicable, right? If somebody else's financial situation gets bad enough, well, of course, that impacts our financial situation, and so on. We're interdependent, is my point, right? So these minds of categorizing people in that way, sort of, it doesn't work, actually, right? Like, it's a mind that's trying to sort of like protect our ego in some sense, but it's unrealistic, and therefore it always fails. So the mind of equanimity is realistic, actually, right? And it's not to say, one more point I'll make, is it's not to say that somebody who develops equanimity doesn't recognize, like, you know, oh, I'm close to this person, they're my sibling, or something like that. Like, you know, obviously one doesn't become foolish or something. Like, it's obvious that one has certain relationships, but with the mind of equanimity, you don't therefore, first of all, you don't therefore assume that your sibling is always going to act a certain way, right? And you recognize things change, and relationships change, and you don't grasp. Does that make sense? So it's not that, like, you know, if you have a, you know, relative who comes for you, you don't, like, you know, you don't recognize, well, I'm their relative and I have some responsibility to help them or so. The point is that you recognize these things change, and, like, I guess I'll make this point, like, using that example of the relative, right? In other words, the person who lacks equanimity will help the relative, and then will feel, deep down will feel, now they better act this way to me, you know. And if they don't, they're in trouble because I did that for them. It's like, that's the lack of, whereas the mind of equanimity, you say, well, if I want to do that, then I'll do it. But it's not permanent, right? In other words, sometimes they're going to do what I think is wonderful, sometimes they're going to do what I think is terrible, because they have their own inner subjective experience of wanting happiness, not wanting suffering. They're not living their life according to my idea of what the category should be. Does that make sense? And how they should live according to my ideas of people should be like this and not like that. They have their own ideas. Kenstrom made this point, and when he was in the Easy Paths there, he says, like, it's kind of funny. He says, you know, when you're here, right? If you're here, at, let's say you're here at Guya Samaja Center, right? Then home is over there. But when you're over there, then there becomes here. But now here is here. You know, but then when you're there becomes here. Right? So there and here are relative terms. He says, so are all relationships. Right? They're all relative like that.
So how do you apply that from a practical standpoint? I mean, you're not ignoring the projection, but sometimes the projection is what propels you to action, right? Like, you know, someone, for instance, there's the environmental walk today. So that action is based on those people saying this, you know, there's a person that thinks environment is not important, therefore I'm going to take action. So if we're saying the projections are temporary or just projections and it changes, how do we just let it sit, or do we tell ourselves, well, I'm going to take action anyway? How does that work from a practical standpoint?
Because to me, the idea behind equanimity and this point you're making is, which is a good point, you know, is that a couple of things. One is that if you're practicing this, right, if you're practicing this kind of approach, then actually I'll make this point. I'll share a real. What it actually made me think about was some of the speeches and writings of Martin Luther King Jr., where he made this point. I thought it was a very profound point, where he was saying he had some recognition of this point. I think, even though he was a practitioner of Christianity and Buddhism, I think he had the same kind of insight. Right? He made this point. He said, like, you know, the person I'm marching against is not really my enemy. Right? The person I'm marching against, in other words, he made this point. He said, if you can't love the person you're marching to protest against, don't march. And there's some recognition in that they can change, right? Like, in other words, if they can change, then marching is useless, actually, right? Like, in other words, if people who don't believe, in your example, if people who don't believe in if I say I want to march for climate change, but I believe that all the people who don't believe in climate change will never believe in it, and it's impossible for them to, well then who am I trying to convince? It's a wasted effort, actually, right? So there has to be some recognition, oh, these differences are temporary, right? These differences are, these differences between me and the person I'm protesting in relation to or something like that are due to temporary circumstances. That person wants to be happy just like I do. That person wants not to suffer just like I do. That person also doesn't want their children to suffer, just like I don't. You know, and if I believe that one of the, and then one has to check. In other words, if I believe somehow that my going to a march or writing a letter or doing some other thing will maybe contribute in some way to helping change the circumstances that then will make things better. But then it would be some idea, I'm marching to also make their life better. Does that make sense? And if one's doing it in that motivation, that's fine. Equanimity wouldn't say, don't do that, or in any of these circumstances. But if one sort of, what equanimity would say is, if I'm marching because I think I'm good and they're bad, and my friends who I'm marching with are wonderful and these other people are terrible, then one is caught in a projection that's not going to help oneself or the other person. That's the idea. So it's not a matter of whether one should or shouldn't. From this point of view, I guess equanimity wouldn't imply that one should or shouldn't take an action, but it implies the underlying attitude of taking the action, which is not sort of to vilify or, anytime we view like another as all bad or as evil or as something like that, then we're caught in a projection. That's not recognizing the temporary nature of things. And so what he's getting at here is he says in the end, so what has ceased is this mind that's grasping with attachment or that has hatred, or is that one's mind calms down. Does that make sense? And if you don't do this first, of course, and you just meditate, this is important as preliminary, right? Or important, like they put this first because they give this metaphor sometimes, like if you have like precious seeds of crops, right? And if you were to like, of course it's a Himalayan metaphor because it's that. If you were to throw those seeds around on the rocky sort of cliffs of a mountain, you won't get anything, right? Like you're not going to, you may get one plant or something in one little crevice, but you're not going to get much, right? Whereas if you have a field that's been plowed and so on, you'll get a rich crop. And it's saying, if you still have this mind that's sort of like this, right, with, a huge attachment, huge aversion, and so on, and you start meditating on these other points about compassion, you're not going to get much out of it, right? Because your mind will be totally biased, and you'll just develop some feeling. Actually, it'll end up, what's the word? You'll end up feeling more and more sort of, maybe a little bit of compassion, but mixed with attachment for the people who you say, they're on my side, right? And then you'll have more and more aversion for the other people. And your compassion won't really increase. It'll just increase for this group, but it'll decrease for that group. Does that make sense? And then, if you say, well, no, now I'm on this side, and then that one won't go down. Neither one will give rise to a kind of overall spiritual growth, a crop of compassion, crop of bodhicitta. Does that make sense why you have to do the meditation on equanimity first? And here, I'll make one more point I left out. Like, so he was talking about the temporary nature, right? So he's making this point also, like, if you feel, based on this, he makes this point there where he says, when you feel like some kind of permanent, this kind of inherent enemy, you can remember, oh, they were my mother in a past life, or my father, or my child, or my spouse, or sibling. And then he says, and when you feel over attached to somebody, overly, then he says, then you can remember they chopped me up in pieces and stabbed me and murdered me in the past life. Because both are true of everybody. And it's making this deeper point. Relationships, this came in the sufferings of samsara. Remember the list of some? One was the uncertainty of samsara, right? And that's just true. There is no permanent anything, right, in samsara. And certainly there's no permanent nature of relationship. Does that make sense? Relationships by their very nature change. And sometimes, and change in ways that, it's actually true, isn't it? If you they change in ways you can never predict, oftentimes, isn't it true? And that's even visible in this life. So he's saying, if you can see that in this life, then imagine over the course of lifetimes how the relationships change. And so having meditated on equanimity, one then moves on to begin the 7-point cause and effect method formally, the actual sequence. Yeah.
Can you go back at so every time we talk about preliminaries before practice, I always get caught or stumble on okay, so for how long we want to do that preliminary until we sort of become, have a conviction, not really conviction, but like, you know, have a strong idea of what we're getting after and then begin? Or how do we determine when preliminary is like, okay, I'm good enough to move on to the next step?
It's a good question. I mean, because I think the answer varies some. Like, I'll say this, like, the advice that, like Lama Zopa Rinpoche and Khenchen Rinpoche sometimes are giving is like, you know, so if let's say you're meditating on Lama Rim, right? You're this question of like, okay, when do I move on? Like, there are various ways to decide that, so I'll go through them. Like one way, sometimes they say like, you know, like Khenchen Rinpoche will sometimes say, for example, and Lama Zopa Rinpoche said the same thing, like, you know, maybe for a few years, because again, Lama Rim takes years, you know, these take years to realize, right? So you sometimes say for a few years you might, or you know, you might first like one time go through each one for a month, right? Like, so meditate on equanimity for a month, then meditate on recognizing all beings, meditate on all those beings as mother for a month. Well, one won't have actually fully realized bodhicitta after doing, you know, what would that be, 7 months or something like that. But one will have got a deep familiarity with the topic, right? If you were doing this subject, you know, and so on. You might do that for all the topics in the whole Lam Rim, you know, just to kind of really familiarize your mind with them. But then let's say then you go back. This has been my own experience. This is like, say with the one of equanimity. You know, then you might go back and say, okay, now I'm familiar with all the points. But then you might spend a number of months on equanimity, just right, really like. And this, I guess, is the difference. Maybe I'll say this. I actually, to more fully answer your question, like, because there are numerous different ways people approach the Lam Rim. Like, one is sort of, they call it like a glance meditation, where you're just sort of familiarizing yourself a little bit. That's not very profound, but it's at least getting your mind familiar. You know, so, I mean, it is profound in a way, but you're not gonna realize it doing just that. So at the beginning, a person might go, okay, I'll just try this out a little bit. But then there comes a point where you want to, if a person actually wants to gain the realization, like Rinpa Rinpoche used to say with Pabonka Rinpoche, where they would like spend months and months and months just on one point, until they really like working through every possible example of anger, of attachment, of indifference and stuff like that. You know, and after a number of months on this one topic, they would then move on to the next one. And he might spend a year or two on, I think particularly meditating all beings as one mother. I heard that sometimes took years, you know, with meditation or something. So that's another way to approach it. And then one more practical point for people, though, that I've noticed with this particular one of equanimity is, I've also seen, though, where just for people who are, not for people who are trying to gain some, like, the actual realization of bodhicitta necessary, but, like, I've known many people who do this meditation regularly, and especially when they get caught up, you know what I mean? So if you start, because one point I would make is, we're always kind of a little caught up in the lack of equanimity, to be honest, but there come points where, like, you know, like, what's I say right? Whether you're really caught up in an attachment to somebody, or really caught up in aversion to somebody, and then that's time to sit down and say, okay, time to do more equanimity practice. You know what I mean? Like, and even if you think you've made progress in equanimity, I think what you oftentimes find is like, your mind says, okay, for a while, and then suddenly you come across some circumstance because things trigger parts of us that we hadn't dealt with yet. Does that make sense? And suddenly, like, you're in a circumstance where you're like, I really hate this person. I can't stand the sight of it, you know, or something. And then it's like, you know, so from a spiritual practice point of view, that's the great. You're like, oh, good, time to do more equanimity practice. Like, I'm projecting, time to fix that. You know what I mean? And the idea then is then you would actually, if you're really practicing, you think, oh, I'm so lucky to have come across this person. They helped. It's not about them. They're helping show me part of myself I hadn't looked at yet. Now I better practice. Does that make sense? Like, and work through what is that? What is that? You know, because I think that's oftentimes what happens. Until, like, eventually, of course, like, so I guess I'm differentiating. That's like for a normal person, right? Like, you may say, okay, well, I've meditated for a couple months on equanimity, now I'm doing something else. But then, like, a while later, something happens in your life where you're feeling those feelings again very strongly. Well, you go back and meditate again, of course.
That helps.
Yeah, and then I guess there comes a point, you know, like for somebody who's a bodhisattva where they, you know, deeply realize that equanimity, you know, it's different. But I guess once they do realize emptiness, for example, it's no longer, they no longer get caught in the same kind of projection. But for us who are beginners, I think we'd go back, you know, oftentimes, like, because that happens, doesn't it? Or like, you know, your mind gets a little more peaceful, but then something happens and you get more
So, just a little bit, so like, so could you say something like realization is sort of like memory? Is it akin to memory, sort of like if you have a strong memory of something, does that equal, does that mean you're realizing it, or you're going into realization?
Like with equanimity in particular, you mean, or with bodhicitta?
With anything.
I guess like it depends on the reason I'm pausing is like, you know, they say there are two different kinds of topics in the Lamrim. You know, so one is emptiness, right? Like for example, or impermanence, where you're realizing, like from the mind's point of view, it's realizing an object, right? Like, or is you're realizing something, like impermanence, right? Whereas, it's like, let's say I'm meditating on the impermanence of this building. And if I keep meditating on how the buildings change moment to moment, they're made up of atoms that are changing moment to moment, air touching objects changes the moment to moment, until I'm sort of like, and there comes a point where I have some experiential realization where I'm like, experiencing gross impermanence, like, oh yeah, it really will end. This building will fall down someday and be nothing, or no longer exist. And then even moment to moment it's changing and so on. That's one kind of realization where you're realizing the truth about something. And that's different from these meditations, where you're not, it's more like you're generating your mind itself into the aspect of a thing. Like, so compassion is not something, it's not like you're realizing, oh, this is what compassion is. Your mind is becoming compassionate. Does that make sense? So those are two different types of topics for meditation. And so when you ask, like, what's realization, it was making me think, because they're different for those two. Yeah. Like for an external object, there's a sequence one goes through. Like, so with emptiness, right, of like, they go through like, like it's in the, what's it called, valid cognition teachings, where you can go through, like, you start with like a wrong view, and then doubt leading in the wrong direction, doubt, middling doubt, doubt leading in the right direction, and eventually you can come to this point where you have like a correct supposition, which is not really a realization, but then there comes, the first realization would be a valid cognition of the topic, where you have a direct, like you're not direct yet, but you have a valid actual realization, an experience of sort of seeing the truth of the thing, and then that can eventually give rise to a direct realization. So that's that sequence. Whereas in these, it's not like that. Does that make sense? Because you're not sort of having a valid realization of compassion, for example, right? Because compassion isn't something you realize outside yourself. Compassion is something you give rise to, and your mind, like sometimes they give the analogy of like, your mind is infused with compassion. Does that make sense? And there, I guess, Lama Tsongkhapa says in his, I can find the actual quote, but, Lama Tsongkhapa actually addresses that question in various places, but I was just going to show one. There it is. So here's his definition of a realization, just because Gabe was asking what's the definition. So he's talking about bodhicitta here, right? But this is Lama Tsongkhapa. He says, in short, if like the mother whose cherished son has fallen into a pit of fire, and who experiences even 1 second of his suffering as an unbearable eternity, your reflection on the suffering of mother sentient beings has made it impossible for you to bear their suffering for even 1 second. And the wish seeking enlightenment, bodhicitta, for their sake arises without any effort. Then you have realized bodhicitta. So does that make sense? So in this case, it's the realization when you're trying to, Lama Tsongkhapa is saying there, in terms of Gabe asked this question about realization, right? So what Lama Tsongkhapa says there is, like a realization of equanimity or bodhicitta is when without any effort, spontaneously, that's your way of relating. So in other words, like, and there's a sequence there too that Khenpo Rinpoche goes through, so I'll just mention it since Gabe asked. Like, Khenpo Rinpoche made this point, he said like, let's say with equanimity, right? At first you don't know anything about it, right? Like you don't know even, you just heard the topic, heard the name, right? Then there comes a point where you just understand it intellectually. Oh, okay, that's what equanimity means. Maybe I was talking today, you can have that, right? Okay, I get what that Lama Tsongkhapa is talking about. That's like just some intellectual understanding that arose from reading and listening and discussing. That's not yet a realization. But then there can come a point where if you're meditating on it, like you say, you're meditating, right? And then like with a lot of effort, like so you have all these anger, you have all this aversion, you have all this attachment, you have all this indifference. But then there comes a point where when you make a lot of effort, you start to have an experience. Like, oh wow, like I'm making that up. You know, like I think this is like the most important like truth, and my mind's just projecting it. I'm just making it up. You know, like, and you start to like go, wow, like you have these experiences where you're meditating like that, and you're like, oh wow, like you know, oftentimes like sometimes with my own experience of that, like I'll be like, I'll go back over my day and I'll pick somebody, right? And then by the time I'm done, I'm like laughing. I'm like, oh my goodness, what was I like? I was feeling that, you know, like I was feeling so like clearly that this was true. Like that's hilarious. It's ridiculous. Like I just made my mind was totally making it up. Sometimes I didn't even know what the person like. It was based on some wrong interpretation. You know, like just all made up. Right? And like they sometimes call that like an effortful or like facsimile level or imitation of the realization. It's not yet effortless. It's not yet spontaneous.
Contrived.
It's contrived, yeah. But it's valuable. You know, that's valuable because that's the only. Kensho Rishi points out that's the only way to get to the uncontrived is through that.
Right.
So you do that over and over and over. Right? You keep having these experiences, and then gradually, what happens is you reach a point, right? Eventually, what Lama Tsongkhapa was getting at is like eventually, if it's equanimity, right? Eventually, you reach a point where, you know, like so somebody does the thing that used to bug you, right? That used to make you not like them or something, or not like people, and you like, and you can kind of like in the moment recognize, oh wow, I would usually have in the past I would have like labeled them enemy. That's really silly.
Mm-hmm.
They're just trying to be happy. You know, like they're just going about their life. Like they're not anything permanent. There's nothing. It's all like changeable. You start to like where it's a natural. As I say it right, where you naturally the way you relate to people is no longer. You no longer get caught in that. So that would be like you know, and it's spontaneous. That's the point. Spontaneous and effortless.
Without effort.
Yeah. And part of that is like, what the part of the implication of this point is that we do, our mind does whatever it's habituated to. See, so if we're habituated to grasping and aversion and indifference, then we do that spontaneously and naturally. And that just comes from our past lives, actually. In other words, why is my mind like that? Because I was like that in my past lives, and I was like that for my childhood. I've always been doing that. Right? And part of what they're getting at here is, if you change that habit by habituating yourself to a new way of seeing, the Dalai Lama points something out. He says, and this way of seeing has an advantage because it's correct, it's reasoned. In other words, it's valid, whereas the other way is invalid. It's unreasonable, actually. And so he says, you know, if you never make any effort, of course your mind will do whatever it was habituated to. But if you make a sincere effort over a long period of time at something that's more realistic, that will eventually win out, and that will become the new habit. And when that becomes spontaneous and effortless, then you gain the realization at that point, truly. And so if there comes a point, you know, so like that's where the person, if they come to the point where like, you know, I think so it's a matter of degree, but as the person more and more sort of has that become spontaneous, then they move on and focus on the next point, of course.
Dr. Arn, so basically you made a division between how to meditate on wisdom and how to meditate on method side of stuff, and probably Gabe is asking about compassion on the method side of stuff. Yeah. My question was, maybe one could analytically meditate to understand some of the method side of stuff. Like in my case, my personal experience would be that day in and day out, you know, when I'm dealing with others at office with colleagues, you know, shoppers or wherever it is, actually I'm analytically thinking about the compassion side of stuff at all times. And actually one could have a realization of that with analytical meditation. Is that possible?
Yeah, well, this is analytic. I mean, this would be categorized as analytical meditation. All this, like equanimity, these meditations where you're thinking of the three people and you're analyzing, you know, these categories are impermanent, everybody wants to be happy and doesn't want to suffer. You know, it's merely a sort of categorization that my mind makes up. Other people label them differently, and you know, not everybody labels this person the way I do. All that's analytical. So yeah, no, so that's still analytical meditation.
But then again, for example, if I were to be a monk, 7-year-old monk in a monastery, and I am not analytically analyzing the method side of stuff. I'm being taught Santi Viva and so on and so forth. And then now I have to step into the world where from that knowledge I have to transfer or translate into experiential stuff as well. So sometimes I think there are two ways of getting there. It could be on the method side of stuff. It could be based on first the wisdom part of it and then applying it. Because in some sense you have to understand the insight of it at some point in time before you come to a unintentional state intentionally, which is obviously the spontaneous part you spoke about.
Well, I guess one point I'll make, because I think actually it's an important distinction then, is that all the Lama meditations actually have an analytical component, except for, well, even calm abiding does, really. So I guess up to a certain point. And so I guess the one point is like, actually, I think in terms of what you were saying, one way of looking at that is in terms of the three kinds of wisdom. So there's the wisdom that arises from listening or studying, right? Then the wisdom that arises from contemplation or analysis, and then there's the wisdom arising from meditation. And so in terms of what you were saying, I think for both the wisdom side and the method side, actually one has to go through all three. So in that sense, so if like one is studying emptiness or if one is studying bodhicitta, in both cases one has to generate first the wisdom from listening and then the wisdom from analysis actually, or contemplation, analysis. That still has to arise, and then there comes the wisdom of meditation where one is familiarizing, right? Meditation just means that having understood it, then one familiarizes the mind with it, right, through meditative practice. So in that sense, analysis applies to both the method and the wisdom side. Does that make sense?
But then there is a separate way of saying, how do you arrive at three wisdom as opposed to four kind of knowledges? When you say knowledge, it might not be as subtle as the wisdom you're talking about.
So which, say again though, so three kinds of wisdom are the listening, contemplating, and then which four kinds of
I
knowledge?
don't remember the exact the description of it, but I read it somewhere where knowledge would be something just part of the hearing, not the part of the second and the third.
Second and third. Okay. That's true. That makes sense, but I'm not sure.
His Holiness spoke about that with Paul Aikman, I guess.
Okay. Sure. That makes sense. Yeah, other comments or questions? Because equanimity is a deep subject.
But the essence of equanimity, what I understood was lessen your attachment and lessen your aversion. Get rid of hatred and get rid of your attachment.
And indifference also in a way, yeah. Because indifference, of course, is also, it's a point, like, it's actually interesting, like, so all three in a way, because indifference, it's interesting, like some people pointed out, it's actually, at first indifference can seem less, in one way indifference can seem less extreme or something, but in another way it's actually a form of course indifference is almost a kind of violence in a way, in the sense of, disregarding the...
Mental violence.
Yeah, it's disregarding the existence in a way of that person as a person, or even an animal as an animal. It's like, it doesn't have to be human in other words. But it's this sort of, let's just say it, like, an indifferent, like they sometimes say that in, this is not leaving Buddhism for just a moment, like even in some Western psychological research they talk about that, like in a family or in those kind of relationships, where somebody sort of, if one person sort of disregards the humanity of another, that is as wounding in some ways as physical violence or verbal violence. And so that indifference is also kind of actually kind of a horrible thing in some ways.
Eventually it will lead to physical violence as well, because it starts with mental violence to start with.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so that's just Lama Tsongkhapa is not saying that, but I think there's some truth to that. I'm just adding my own reflection that kind of indifference, and also it's totally the opposite of bodhicitta, right? Bodhicitta is a sense of deep affection and connection and love and compassion for all beings. So that mind of indifference is also kind of a direct obstacle to the development of bodhicitta, and that's why we have to remove it before we can.
Like ethnical differences and racial differences, because they're there, subtle as they may be, they're there, and that's a form of, like discriminating.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, when you refer to indifference, going back to the example before about the person on the street, they were part of the bench.
Right.
That's the ultimate indifference. The person, I dislike Hitler, I like the Dalai Lama, the person on the bench was a bench, or they were part of the bench.
Yeah, which is kind of, I mean, at first one can say, oh, well, that just seems, if you look at yourself, if I look at myself, like at times when I notice that kind of mind, it's like, at first I was like, oh, well, I was just busy, and then you pause and you're like, it's actually horrific in a way, though, right? Like, to not recognize the difference between that person's humanity and
But you're the psychologist.
Yeah.
What I've read, at least, and been told, is that part of it's something you pick up as a child, because at least in our current world, the sensory overload is so intense that I remember taking my daughter baby jogger at 18 months. It was impossible because she'd want to stop and see everything.
Yeah.
By the time she was 2.5, she had started to be able to start ignoring things, and we just were walking down the street or driving down the street. And if you actually took in everything around you while you're driving a car, you'd probably have an accident constantly because you'd be looking at everything. So you learn to just, and only thing that's relevant is things that's right around you. Everything else you're oblivious to.
Yeah, and part of, like I said, just to contemplate this though, can you imagine, again, because like part of the difference between how a bodhisattva is in the world and how a non-bodhisattva is, right, is that, like as an ordinary person is sort of just going around, right, you're describing, with all the stuff going on around us, like our sort of, like going back to what Lama Tsongkhapa said here, right, like an ordinary person, their sort of normal, like baseline state as they're going around the world is kind of egocentrism, right? It's like, well, what, am I going to be late? Am I going to be early? How am I feeling? Am I thirsty? Am I hungry? That's sort of our main concern is in our mind is sort of, is this person slowing me down when I want to go faster? Or is that person trying to speed me up when I'm trying to go slow? And it's like everything is in reference to my own ego, in a sense. Whereas the bodhisattva's like baseline state as they're going around the world is love and compassion, actually, right? Like, so, like, in other words, as they're walking around, like, it's not that they're necessarily stopping and talking to every person or something, because that may not be practical, but their baseline state, and as soon as, like, what's there say? First of all, their baseline state is loving compassion, right? And it doesn't mean they're ignoring themselves. If they're hungry, they eat or something, or sometimes, but their baseline state is actually loving compassion, and whenever somebody, right, so they're always available, right, to interact in a loving, compassionate way, so it's a different baseline, I heard somebody told me a funny story. They were at Kopan Monastery, in Nepal, and I think they said, they were upset about something. They were very upset. It's like they couldn't sleep, like it happens. So they got up and they were just taking a walk, like, because they were so upset. And they bumped into Lama Yeshe, and they said, Lama, what are you doing up? It's so late. And he said, I was looking for someone who's suffering. And then like he kept walking, and they kept walking, and they said, wait a second, I'm suffering, And he said, oh, really? Okay, that's what I was looking for. Then I was, just out about looking for somebody who's suffering. I think it's just a matter, funny story, but it's like this idea of that's how the bodhisattva is going around the world. It's like looking for suffering beings, even when they're out for a jog or something like that. Whereas, if we're out for a jog, we're, saying like, what's my heart rate? My focus, might be like, what's my heart rate, and what's my, water intake, and what's my, have I gone like some percentage further than I did 3 months ago, so I'm getting more fit, so that I'm, whereas the bodhisattva's attitude in jogging, for example, is love, right? Is compassion, is presence with others, is this wish to be available as a compassionate presence to all beings and to progress to enlightenment for the welfare of all. So you said, it's like, it's sort of, I don't think, it's my own impression, is like, I remember that, I'll just share one more point. I remember that, like, when I would go with, when I was taking Rinpa Rinpoche sometimes, he was a great practitioner of this, of bodhicitta, and when I would go with him to, like, doctor's offices, because he was ill at the time, and we would go, I remember, like, in other words, he wasn't invasive, he didn't speak English, and most of the people there didn't speak Tibetan, so he would, he'd be there, and, like, he'd just be like, I remember sitting with him in the waiting room, he had cancer at the time. I remember sitting with him in the waiting room, I was, like, sitting next to him, and I was anxious, because I was like, well, are they going to take us quick enough, and will I get to my office quick? Egocentric, right? Like, I'm here because I love him, and I'm devoted to him, but also I'm worried about if I'm late to work, and will the doctor take too long, and sometimes this doctor's office is like that, you know. So I'm like caught up in, and I looked over at him, and he's the one with cancer. I'm just the driver, you know. And I was looking at him, and I looked like, oh wow, he looks more at ease sitting in this chair in a waiting room in like an ugly chair in an ugly waiting room in an oncology office than I've ever felt in my life. Like I was looking at him out of the corner of my eye, and I'm like, I've never felt as at ease as he looks. And I thought the metaphor that came to my mind just spontaneously in that moment was, he looks like a king sitting on his throne. He's a cancer patient sitting in a waiting room, you know. And then, and what I noticed was this. It just gets at your point. Like a nurse would come over then. Like the nurse came out to take him in, and he looked at her with so much love that she started to tear up. She was like, and she like looked at me and was just like overwhelmed because nobody looked at her with that much love in her life, except him, you know. And she was like, "Who is he? Where'd you meet him? Like, I want someone like him in my life, you know." Like, he was like an 84-year-old guy or so, you know. But it was this point about like, that's what Bodhisattva, you know what I mean? It's like his baseline. It wasn't that he was walking up to strangers and saying, "Let me help you," or something, right? But like, and I remember that the same thing. I took him to Dulles Airport, and the woman behind the counter, like I'm talking to her like, you know, here's his ticket and here's his passport, and like she like wouldn't look at me. She was just like dumbfounded because he was looking at her and she was looking at, and he had this look on his face of utter love, you know. He wasn't saying a word, you know, like, and she like again, she looked at me like nobody ever looked at her that way with that much love, and so she was so moved that she got flustered and couldn't do her job for 2 minutes or something. You know, she was like so, and I was like, oh wow, that's what it's like to be, and one day I said to him something. I said something like, wow, the way you've dealt with this illness is just like so unbelievable. I said, it's because of it must be because of your realizations of the Dharma. And I said, I mean because of compassion and bodhicitta. And he said, okay, that's good. You know, he's like, I can accept that. Compassion is good. So my point is like that for me, that was an experience of seeing, oh, that's what a different baseline. You know, like I'm going around going, am I late for work? What if there's bad traffic? Like, what if then I, whatever, have some problem with my car or something, or, you know, like I need gas and then I'm going to have to, like my mind is sort of focusing on those things. And it's not that bodhisattvas aren't aware of that they have to have gas in their car if they want to go somewhere. But their main focus is on others, right, is on love and compassion for others. That's their main baseline. Does that make sense? That's their main way of being in the world. So that's the difference, you know, like, yeah, I remember that same thing. I think I might have told some of you when I heard that story. When the that oncologist actually, who was a very sweet man, like when he told Rinpoche, he said to Rinpoche, you're gonna die from this, and again, Rinpoche, just his facial expression was like, I was watching this interaction. Like the doctor was, we were late because he had just told somebody else they were gonna die, I think it was, and then he does this all day, right? And then he's like saying to Rinpoche this, and Rinpoche like leans over, and like the way a mother would say to their child, like kind of held him and said, "It's going to be okay, you know, don't worry. I know you have a hard job," and you know, kind of. And the doctor like looked at him and just like almost got faint, or he got like all the blood went out of his face, you know. And he said, "I spent my entire career." He was like an older man. He said, "I spent my entire career telling people they're going to die. Like nobody's ever shown love to me at that moment." And later the treatment was working, and he said, "I was wrong, that you could live longer." And he did the same thing. He reacted the same way, with this kind of very loving, kind of grabbing him. And that's my point is, I'm just using him as the example, right? But the point is like, you know, when it says like, Lama Tsongkhapa says this thing, right? The baseline state, or like, what does he say? Effortless, right? The effortless way of being present in the world is love and compassion. Or the effortless way is that's the goal. Does that make sense? That's the realization. It's like where that's your normal way of being present, and that you're not, like Rinpoche wasn't mainly thinking about his own death, right? That wasn't the main concern. The main concern was, here's a sentient being, like my whole existence is to be a benefit to sentient beings. Let me connect with this sentient being. Does that make sense? Let me connect with this person through love, and I'll do that as I'm living, I'll do that as I'm dying, I'll do that in between, I'll do that when I come back. Just like that's my way of being present in the world. That's the bodhisattva. Does that make sense?
What was the name of the Rinpoche you said?
What's that?
Which Rinpoche was that?
Oh, that was Rinpoche, R-I-B-U-R.
In New Jersey?
No, he was, I mean, his new incarnation's in India now, but he lived in, he was, actually, there's, if you research him, he was,
Picture right there.
oh yeah, that's him up there. Yeah, on the mandala cover there. The first one all the way to the side. You can see that look on his face. That's the same look he was giving, I think, to the woman in the airport or something. But yeah, he was actually somebody where, actually, maybe I'll tell this story just because it's a little tangent, but I'll just share it. I remember this because when I first heard of Rebbe Rinpoche, I read this story. It was an interview with him. I'd met him, I think, once, and there was this interview, and he was tortured. He was captured, and for 18 years he was imprisoned during the Cultural Revolution and so on, and he didn't escape when the Dalai Lama escaped. And so he was tortured for years and years in a what's it called, Chinese Communist government prison in Tibet. And this interview, somebody said, "How did you get through that, or what was your experience like?" And he said, although my body suffered, he said, although they did things you can't imagine, and my body suffered terribly, in my mind there was only pure joy. That was what he said. And I thought I have to I had this thing in me. I thought I have to understand how a person could. And I became very intrigued because I thought I work in this area as a psychologist, and I thought I oftentimes see people who have the best circumstances on the planet, right? And they wish they were dead, and I thought, that's just my job, right? So I often will see people where everybody else on the planet wishes they had this birth, right? They have a beautiful house and a beautiful partner and beautiful children and a good job, and everybody else on the planet wishes they had what they have, and they wish they were dead, right? And I was like, wow, so it's possible, I know that's possible because I see it every week, but it's possibly the opposite, right? To be somebody who has the worst, literally the worst human circumstances on the entire planet, and be totally joyful. And I was like, I have to see how somebody can, I want to know how somebody can be that, what does it take to be that? And so I actually think that my own, long after Rebbe Rinpoche passed away, it occurred to me that he knew I had wished that and decided to grant me my wish by coming here when he had cancer. And I was sort of there as he went through chemotherapy. And he was like, well, in this culture, that's the closest you're going to get to the worst circumstance. It's like in the Washington, D.C. area, the worst circumstance you can pretty much is to be dying of cancer and going through chemotherapy. So it's the closest equivalent that I had access to. So he came and allowed me to sort of participate in that process. And I was like, oh wow. Finally I understood the answer. It was bodhicitta. In other words, if you have bodhicitta, I was like, oh, he loved the torturers. He loved the Chinese communist soldiers who were torturing him, and he loved his fellow prisoners, and he had compassion for the torturer as well as the tortured. And I was like, and that was his point. It's bodhicitta. If you have bodhicitta, your mind's always joyful. Whether you have good, because I also saw him. Is that okay to say? I think it's okay. But later I saw him I once visited him. He was staying in a kind of small mansion owned by Richard Gere. He was doing a retreat there. And I was like, oh, I've seen him in the worst circumstances and I've seen him in the best circumstances, and he's equally happy, and he was happy regardless. I mean, he had the same level of joy regardless of whether he was sitting in a beautiful, this beautiful, wonderful house and beautiful property with the best food, or he was unable to eat and going through kind of horrible physical suffering. His mind was just as joyful in any circumstance. And he was clearly, over and over, both his demeanor was saying it, and a couple times he actually said it, is, that's bodhicitta. It's bodhicitta that's that. You're joyful whatever happens if you realize bodhicitta. That's his. Not that he would say he realized bodhicitta, but he kind of almost half admitted it once. Actually, he kind of admitted it a few times. Anyway, so I'm going off on a tangent, but it was a way to answer the question. Does that make sense? It's this idea of, that's what I mean by the baseline level. It's not where it's no longer an intellectual thing. At the beginning, or for those who are like us who are just starting or something, it's well, I want to develop compassion, and I try to think about it, and that's good. In other words, that's the only way to realize bodhicitta, is to start with that. But then if we keep progressing, it eventually becomes more and more, gradually more spontaneous. Does that make sense? And it's a gradual process until it becomes one's totally natural way of being in the world, and that's the goal. I guess probably we should stop there and not go on to because then we're done at that section. The next point is, maybe I'll just introduce it and then we'll stop. So the next point, actually the heading is accomplishing or realizing, or understanding, or viewing, and maybe I say accomplishment, I would say viewing all sentient beings as attractive, right? That means like viewing all sentient beings not attractive like physically, like good looking, but developing a mind of like warmth and affection, right? It's the next topic, is how do you develop a mind that views all sentient beings as precious, or as to be cherished? That's really a better way to say it. Does that make sense? And so the point here is like, having developed a mind of equanimity, that's not enough, right? Then you want to develop a mind that views all sentient beings, each person, you know, each animal, each sentient being, each creature, as precious, or as worthy, or as someone to be cherished. Does that make sense? And so he's going to get into the next topic when we meet next time is, so how do you develop that kind of mind? Does that make sense? And so that's what we'll, and then how do you kind of develop that for all beings? Because if you develop that kind of mind for all beings, then naturally love will come, and then compassion will come, and then from compassion you can generate that mind, the unusual or extraordinary attitude of universal responsibility, and then bodhicitta. So this is the hard part, is to develop this mind of that views all beings as precious and to be treasured. I'll make one last point. You know, like, actually, each of us, right? That's what we want most in life, isn't it? Is to feel some, even like, I mean, people wait their whole lives or hope their whole lives for one person to view them as treasured or precious, right? If you get that for like a few hours, you feel, right? Like, you feel so fortunate, right? Like, oh wow, like, for a few years, this, like, sometimes people like they're, whatever, they had somebody in there, like an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent, or something. They say, oh wow, that was such a, you know, that was so precious because that person treasured me. You know, they loved me for who I am, without an agenda or something like that. It could feel like that. Or one person, you know, who you had, right? And the Bodhisattva is trying to cultivate that for all beings. And it has cultivated that for all beings. So that's why also, like, that's why people are so, like, if you get to meet a Bodhisattva, it's so happy, right? Is that, like, they love you without an agenda. That's part of the definition of a Bodhisattva. They don't love you because you have to be what they want to support their, what's the word, ego-centered project or something of life. Right? They love you because they love you, which is what we all want. So like we can give that to others. And actually, and part of the karma is if you give that to others, you also receive it. It happens, then it becomes like a natural process. Okay. Sorry I went off on a tangent. I hope that was okay. Let's do the verse with dedication. Supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has risen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara.